So I think she was said it all. We're leaving an insane amount of money on the table by not investing in women's health. I mean, 9,500% return on investment is just insane. And that's what's happening by not investing in women's health research. We're hindering our fundamental understanding of how to deliver quality medicine, which brings us to innovative FemTech startups tackling the gender data health gap. And our next panel, actually, which is on the gender data health gap. I'd like to start with a stat to illustrate part of the problem. Did you know that 70% of those affected by chronic pain conditions are women? Yet 80% of research into pain is conducted on male humans or rodents, which results in an obvious data gap in terms of understanding how pain manifests in women. Women are significantly more likely than men to be prescribed sedatives rather than painkillers when they're in pain. According to the National Institutes of Health in the US, the historical lack of research focus on women's health concerns has compromised the quality of health information available to women, as well as the healthcare they receive. So in this session, we wanted to discover the innovative ways FemTech startups are collecting gender-specific medical data to close the gap and better understand female-specific metrics. We have Priyanka Jain, the CEO and co-founder of Evie, an at-home vaginal microbiome test to help get to the root of recurrent vaginal infections and other symptoms. We have Anna Lee, the co-founder and head of engineering at Lioness, a sexual wellness company dedicated to championing female sexual pleasure and health. Lioness actually has the world's largest data set in terms of female physiological sexual function. And we have Eric D, who actually spoke at last year's summit. He's the CEO and founder of Bloom Life, a women's health company designing remote prenatal care solutions to improve the health of women and babies. Which begs the question, could more information about pregnancy and normal labor lead to better care, less invasive measures, improved birth outcomes, and lower C-section rates? And I guess you'll just have to listen to this panel to see. This panel is going to be moderated by Dr. Yana Aznavour. Yana has an MD, PhD in gynecology and medical genetics. She is the CEO and founder of Endometriosis, an at-home test for non-invasive diagnosis of endometriosis. Yana has been a principal investigator in an international clinical study devoted to genomic biomarkers of endometriosis. It was published in numerous peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of Minimally Invasive Gynecology. The work received an award from the American Association of Gynecologic Laparoscopists for the best research in minimally invasive gynecology. And on that note, Yana, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Ariana, for such a warm introduction, and the whole FemTech Summit team for the fascinating meeting and for having me today, of course. And I'm delighted to open this panel by talking about one of the largest gender gaps, the pain gap. Actually, do you know that 270 million women right now experience pelvic pain? And unfortunately, very often they just keep it inside and suffer in silence. But in 70% of cases, this pelvic pain is associated with endometriosis, still the most enigmatic women's disease. So just a brief recap what endometriosis is. It is a condition in which tissue typically located only inside the uterus is found outside of it, on ovaries, bowel, bladder, whenever you can ever imagine in the body. And the huge problem is that major surgery is still the only available option to diagnose it. And due to that, the diagnostic delay is 8 years on average. And it's unacceptable. Women with endometriosis suffer for years, and most of them are initially misdiagnosed with another condition. And despite 150 years of research in this field, there are still no effective biomarkers and no tests for endometriosis detection except surgery. Our team spent more than 5 years investigating genomic features of endometrial cells and endometriosis. And our step-by-step research and strict inclusion and exclusion criteria allowed us to develop a novel and effective biomarker of endometriosis. We started with the analysis of all available data on molecular and genomic abnormalities in endometrial samples of women with endometriosis and revealed key molecular pathways underlying this disease development. We then compared endometrial samples of women with and without endometriosis and revealed statistically significant differences at the gene expression level. And these results pointed out the original concept that endometriosis is not a disease of cells that migrate from the uterus and create endometriosis lesion outside of it, but also of the cells that remain inside the uterus. And we decided to move forward and compare endometrium and endometriosis lesions of the same women with endometriosis. And turned out that endometrium, which remains in the uterus, can represent genomic features that occur in endometriosis lesions outside of the uterus. And this analysis allowed us to develop a gene expression signature of the endometrium, which is characteristic of women with endometriosis. We performed a 5-fold cross-validation study to make sure that this biomarker effectively differentiates the endometrium of women with endometriosis from those without. And in this study, we also validated our biomarker on other somatic tissue samples to be sure that this biomarker is specific for endometrium. Moreover, to exclude any biases, we also checked how our biomarker will perform on other tissue samples that were collected by other researchers. And again, our gene expression signature effectively distinguished the endometrium of women with endometriosis. This gene expression analysis should be performed on endometrial cells primarily. And the easiest way to collect these cells is to extract them from menstrual blood. And we developed the non-invasive test and at-home menstrual blood collection kit and preparing for beta testing this summer and further launch. And as Ariana mentioned, our work was awarded by the American Association of Gynecological Laparoscopists for the best research in minimally invasive gynecology. And we published our results in peer-reviewed journals, first part of them, and filed the patent applications for the novel non-invasive diagnostic test for endometriosis. And all these years of clinical research are dedicated to women who suffer from pain. And we need to stop normalizing women's pain and do everything towards changing the whole women's healthcare system. Thank you so much. That's all from me. And here are my contacts if you want to reach out to me. And I'm moving forward and welcoming our amazing speakers today. Please welcome on our virtual stage, Priyanka Jain, Anna Lee, and Dr. Eric T. So great pleasure to see you guys here. And I'm going to introduce our first speaker. It's Priyanka Jain, who is going to talk to us about the vaginal health gap. As Ariana pointed, Priyanka is CEO and co-founder of AVI, an at-home vaginal microbiome test. A bit more about her background. She received her bachelor's in Stanford University, where she was a Mayfield Fellow and president of Stanford Women in Business. Priyanka is also a spokesperson for the United Nations Foundation's Grow Up campaign, chair of the Acumen Fund's General Council, and she is on the innovation board for the X Prize Foundation. And Priyanka is creating new data sets that will help us improve diagnosis and treatments of vaginal infections and other women's health conditions. Please welcome Priyanka.
Thank you so much, Yana, and congratulations on everything you're working on. It is so incredibly exciting. Okay, let me know if you can see my screen.
Not yet.
Now?
I guess it takes a bit, so we'll just wait. Yeah, right now we can see it.
You can see it? Okay, amazing.
Yeah, perfect.
Well, I am so excited to be here, and thank you so much to everyone for having me. And like Yana mentioned, I'm Priyanka. I'm the co-founder and CEO of EVI. It's funny, I usually start with a lot of information about the gender health gap because usually not a lot of people realize how bad the gender health gap truly still is. But it sounds like in this audience, maybe I don't need to do so much convincing. But really, I thought it's helpful to start here because this is actually why I quit my job to start EVI, which is when I realized that women weren't required to be in clinical research in the US until 1993. And that to this day, women are diagnosed on average 4 years later than men for over 700 diseases, right? To what Yana was saying earlier about our abysmal ability to diagnose so many female health conditions. And our interest at EVI is really thinking about, if so much of the way that we have defined health and disease forever has been based on essentially middle-aged, mid-sized white men, what are the unique biomarkers or signals that the female body is giving off that we could do a better job measuring or paying attention to, so that we actually could become better at predicting disease, diagnosing disease, and treating disease as it uniquely manifests in women, right? Because as I always say, turns out women actually are not small men, and there are a lot of unique biomarkers that we can and should be paying attention to. And that's really the focus of EVI. We're on a mission to radically reinvent the way that we understand and also treat the female body, specifically by discovering and leveraging female-specific biomarkers. And the first set of biomarkers that we're starting with, as Jana mentioned, is the vaginal microbiome. And usually when I say that, I get one of two questions. Either, what is the vaginal microbiome, or why is that where you're starting? So I figured I'd spend my 5 minutes doing a quick 101 on what the vaginal microbiome is and why it matters. Here's my extremely accurate depiction of what the vaginal microbiome looks like. And I'm sure most people are aware of microbiomes more generally, essentially just a community of bacteria and fungi that live in a certain part of your body, and in this case, in your vagina. And if you think about the vagina's role kind of structurally within the human body, it's essentially the connection between the outside world, which is full of tons of pathogens, and some of your most important internal reproductive organs. And essentially, we've co-evolved with this community of microbes that lives in our vagina that do a lot more than just kind of hang out there. It turns out that when your vaginal microbiome is in kind of a healthy or protected state, it's dominated by a certain type of bacteria that actually produce lactic acid, hydrogen peroxide, and keep the vaginal environment really acidic with a low pH. And that's really important because then when pathogens might get into your vagina, they actually can't survive or thrive. So we essentially have what I like to call kind of like a local immune system with these microbes that are playing this really important role in protecting us from these pathogens. But I always say, God forbid women live their lives. You have sex with someone new, you sit in your swimsuit for too long, you have a long period, all of those things that could increase the pH of your vagina. And what you start to see is that these disruptive microbes can start to take over. And as women, what we experience is these extremely prevalent and frustrating infections. Yeast infections, recurrent UTIs, bacterial vaginosis, you name it, which affect over 30% of women every year and cause these really frustrating symptoms. But what research has started to show is that this breakdown of that protective barrier when you have a healthy vaginal microbiome does more than just cause these annoying and frustrating infections. It turns out that also that breakdown of that wall can also be associated with everything from IVF failure to preterm birth, to STI acquisition, cancer progression, and so much more. And it blew my mind that even though, as a person with a vagina, I had no access to this information on my own body, and that no one in the healthcare system was using this more precise information to help me understand what was going on or how I could get better. And that was the beginning of EVI and our first product, which is an at-home vaginal health test, which is the first time anyone's using what's called metagenomic sequencing, which allows us to look at all bacteria and fungi that are present and the relationship to each other in the microbiome, so that we can help anyone with a vagina better understand what's going on down there, why does it matter to your overall health, and then what can you actually do about it. And I am so grateful and lucky every single day to work with the most amazing group of medical and science advisors who are helping us make sure that we're able to actually translate this really exciting, new, complex technology into something that a user can actually engage with today. And I mean, very excitingly, we've only been around for about a year now, but we're already starting to find really exciting opportunities to create much better care for the vagina that's much more precise, holistic, and preventative. And we always say that not only are we doing that research, but along the way, we care a lot about making sure that women have access to much better understandings of what's going on in their own bodies through much better personalized insights, education, care, etc. Two, I always say, women are smart. It's time to treat them that way. Let's give them the data on their own bodies so that they can make more informed healthcare decisions for themselves. And along the way, let's get comfortable saying the word vagina and talking about vaginal health, because these are some of truly the most common conditions in women. And we've suffered in silence for so long. And so we're very excited to be building many platforms that help normalize and talk about the many conditions that women often face alone. But thank you so much for having me. And I'm so excited for this panel discussion with so many other amazing people.
I'm Oh, sorry. Thank you so much, Priyanka. It's so unbelievable that so many research is devoted to gut microbiome, but less research is devoted to vaginal one. And it's so great that you are working on that and changing this paradigm. Thank you so much. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Anna Lee right now, our next amazing speaker. She is co-founder and head of engineering at Lioness, a sexual wellness company advocating for female sexual health and pleasure. And a mechanical engineer by training, Anna and her team have built the first smart vibrator that helps improve pleasure and orgasms through biofeedback data. Can you only imagine? And the Lioness Vibrator includes AI-assisted guidance based on the largest data set of female physiology under arousal and orgasm. And Anna was also listed as a Forbes 30 Under 30 and Paper Magazine's Asian Women Creators You Need to Know. So here to discuss how she builds a new understanding of sexual health, please welcome Anna Lee.
Thank you so much for having me, and hi to FemTechnology Summit. This is such an incredible experience. I feel like my bio kind of went over all my slides, so I will go through this quickly, and I'm hoping that some of the questions that come up, I'm happy to continue to elaborate and just explain a little bit more about all the cool things that we're doing. So we're changing the vibrator game. We started about 7 years ago, and the idea is to crowdsource orgasms to improve understanding and outcomes in women's health and beyond. So we're Lioness, and this is my incredible co-founder Liz, our co-founder and CEO, and I'm the co-founder and head of engineering. And my background is I was working at Amazon as a mechanical engineer for a team called Concept Engineering. So we were doing products that were supposed to be concept products 3 to 5 years out for Amazon that we basically build prototypes and then try to pitch it to the executive team at Amazon to get it greenlit as a project. And I think one of the big things that I've realized while working there was that as incredible as my team was, I was the only woman engineer with a team of 16 male engineers. And as incredible as they were, I think one of the biggest things that was an aha moment for me was just realizing how many products are not really designed with people with vulvas or women in mind. And as much as people say products are unisex, it's sometimes very much not in that sense. And I was always very, very, very scared of my own body. I always tell people this just to feel like it's a normal thing of like that I didn't come from a space where I was very open about talking about vibrators or orgasms or, my own sexual pleasure. I grew up in Korea as in a very conservative religious Korean family. And we never talked about sex. And for me, this was also a journey to help me learn about my body and realizing how much lack of information and education there is in this space, and to find the right answers. So we started about almost 7 years ago now. And now Liz and I both got our EDC certified as sex educators, and just been kind of figuring out how we move the conversation and culture around this space. And this really all started just realizing that orgasms have been neglected for a very long time, especially female sexual pleasure. There's a huge, huge lack of research around female sexual function, and I will get a little bit more into it as we go into the panel. But basically, when we're talking about male sexual function versus female sexual function, the research between the two is just such a stark difference. And alongside that, we're seeing lacking spaces for sex education, questions, and understanding of our own bodies, and a lot of it due to the societal taboos and cultural stigmas. But one of the big things we know is that orgasms are the canary in a coal mine for health conditions. They can actually be indicators for different health conditions and how interconnected it is to your overall wellness and health. And so what we really want to do is give people the tools to help them actually understand their bodies and see the different changes. And so what we've created is Lioness, and the idea is that we use precision sensors, biofeedback, and AI to track sexual responses and orgasms. And the main way that we do that is using what we measure is pelvic floor muscle contractions. It's one of the most reliable methods for measuring an orgasm, although there are different markers like heightened heart rates or pupil dilation and things like that. Most of the research that has been done has been measuring with pelvic floor contractions. So for example, how your vaginal muscles, pelvic floor muscles, or anal muscles squeeze and relax involuntarily can actually indicate the orgasm. And so what you see on, this was a GIF, I'm not sure if it's working, but what you see is the shaft of the lioness, and there are 2 force sensors embedded on the shaft. And so when it's inserted, you can actually see in whether real time, or it can record that data and you can upload it to your app afterwards, and you can see how those muscles are squeezing and relaxing. And so that way you can track your pleasure over time and understand different influences and factors that could be affecting your pleasure or arousal and orgasms. So it's just a really unique way to do that. And you can actually see kind of cool changes depending on, I've done like personal experience of like how alcohol can change it, how lack of sleep, stress, like all of those different things can really change those factors. And so it's just a new way to visualize, I think, sexual pleasure, because I think in overall health, we track things like sleep, fitness, and all of those, but we don't really do that for sexual pleasure a lot of times. So this is kind of what the data will look like for the most part. These are 3 different people's data. The ocean wave is actually mine. And so what we're doing is over time, because we have all this data and information, we're able to see some really cool things with how different people can experience pleasure and orgasms. So just the more fun part of it is that we have seen 3 different types of orgasm patterns that happen. And we very cutely named it the ocean wave, the avalanche, and the volcano. And so the ocean wave is your kind of, we've seen most people with the ocean wave pattern. So you can see like this is all your pelvic floor contractions. And then the part that's highlighted in red is the orgasm itself. So you'll see a really rhythmic pelvic floor movement. That's a squeeze and relax, kind of in the same force over time. And then we've seen avalanches that are similar to waves in the sense it's like a squeeze and relax, but it starts very high and then it goes down in force over time. And then we've seen the volcano, which is your classic kind of how you see it. I think a lot of times how they depict it in media and movies, you'll see kind of like, lower forces and then a huge explosion of force at the end. And this is a kind of a fun one to actually understand, so that when we talk about orgasms, when, for example, my friend is talking about it, I'm like, am I having one? Like, am I doing it correctly? And it's really maybe that we're all different types. And so far we've seen in our data and research that people don't jump from one type to another. So this is just like a fun entryway to seeing like, even like being able to understand your body in such a different way of like, okay, well, next time maybe if you can have an orgasm, like think about what that felt like for you, and kind of giving people that cue to help them dig a little deeper and start being more mindful of their pleasure and arousal, and just get more information about their own bodies. And so overall, as much as we have a vibrator that's very, very cool and very, very smart, the idea is that we really want to do it for science. And over these past few years, we've now have the largest physiological data set on female sexual function, and it's about over 150,000 data sets at this point. And our whole idea is that we want to really expand the research and understanding that we have around female sexual function and how those different things can correlate, whether it's stress, concussions, and all of those things. And so one of the biggest things we've launched in the past year is the Lioness Sex Research Platform. And this enables the users of the Lioness Vibrator, and only if they want to, opt into studies led by researchers. So giving people a way to connect to researchers to actually expand the research and get different audiences and also that data, so that there can be just a lot more information out there. So really, really excited to be here. And I'm really just excited to be on this panel with amazing speakers. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. And first of all, for educating women about their sexual health and sexual pleasure, because it's been a taboo for so long. And it's still in many countries, not only in Korea, I suppose. And yeah, thank you so much for your research and for your product. It's my pleasure now to move forward and welcome Dr. Eric D, who is going to talk to us about the personalized prenatal care. Eric earned his bachelor's in bioengineering from Cornell and his master's and PhD in biomedical engineering from UCLA. Eric is CEO and co-founder of Bloom Life, a women's health company designing remote prenatal care solutions to improve the health of women and babies, of course. Bloom Life received numerous awards for its pioneering work, including Fast Company World-Changing Ideas, Johnson & Johnson Quickfire Challenge, Richard Branson's Extreme Tech Challenge, MedTech Innovator Award, and last but not least, was earned recognition at the White House Precision Public Health Summit. Please welcome Eric D.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here with you all today, and it's really inspiring just to see the work of all these great companies and how much progress has been made in this space over the past several years. As mentioned, my name is Eric D. I'm co-founder and CEO of Bloom Life. We are a clinical stage women's health company focused on developing remote prenatal care solutions to improve the health of women and babies. Just to provide a little background on the space for those who aren't familiar, but over the past several decades, we've seen a significant increase in the rates of high-risk pregnancies and pregnancy complications globally. The current data from Blue Cross Blue Shield indicates that over 20% of their commercial members are clinically high risk today. And these high-risk pregnancies are driving over 60% of the $110 billion spent annually on pregnancy, childbirth, and postpartum care. The challenge here is that these high-risk moms, of course, they need a lot more screening and clinical management. And at the same time as we have this increasing rate of high-risk pregnancies, we concurrently have a shortage of maternal health care providers that continues to get worse. There's about 9,000 too few OBs today in the United States. And effectively, women living in over 50% of the US are considered maternity care deserts. And so these are areas where getting access to basic prenatal care can be a challenge, let alone specialty care you might need if you're a high-risk pregnancy. And so this is the problem space that Bloom Life is working in. What we find is in looking at the space is that there's in fact been very, very little innovation in women's health and in prenatal care in decades. Much of prenatal care is still centered around episodic spot checks at the doctor's office using really antiquated technology, including some devices that are shown in the background there called a cardiotocogram. At the same time, there's very little comprehensive use of risk assessment. And in fact, many known risk factors that have been shown in medical literature to impact risk of things such as preterm birth are poorly addressed today. And at the same time, we also have very limited use of digital tools to educate and empower women. And so this is the problem that Bloom Life is looking to solve. And so what we've been developing really is the technology layer to power future prenatal care by combining connected devices with data analytics to improve access to care, reassure and empower women, and provide clinicians with better information to more effectively screen and manage pregnancy complications. The idea is that with connected health solutions that go into the home, we could do a more comprehensive job of assessing both maternal and fetal health throughout pregnancy. With this data, we can improve risk stratification to help tailor care and more effectively address modifiable risk factors sooner. And of course, develop more predictive models to identify acute critical events to reduce adverse outcomes. Hopefully it's not too loud. My son seems to be singing in the background over here. And I actually think that I may have the wrong deck up here. I don't know how this one got going, but we'll keep going through and might have to jump ahead. So part of our solution is a proprietary wearable device that we developed. It functions like a cardiac monitoring patch, similar to the extent that we measure electrophysiological signals, such as maternal EKG, fetal EKG, and maternal EHG. And with this device that's worn on the belly, we could extract out parameters that are used in clinical practice today, such as contractions and fetal heart rate, parameters that doctors ask women to track today, which we really don't have really good tools to do today, such as fetal movement, or track parameters that have been shown in medical literature to impact risk of adverse events. But we have very few tools to effectively screen today, such as maternal stress and maternal sleep. And so really, the device fits within a larger platform. And so beyond our own device, we have the ability to integrate in with third-party devices, looking at blood pressure cuffs, blood glucose monitors, urine monitoring, things that are used in normal prenatal care to assess maternal and fetal health. Of course, all these devices connect to an app where we could also provide personalized feedback, education around what the different parameters are that doctors may be asking women to track, provide clinical surveys that, of course, allow you to capture more of the qualitative information that is also very important. All of this data is collected from home. It's sent to the cloud where we process this in our analytics backend, and with the immediate goal of being able to generate reports that inform clinical care, knowing all the things that we know today about what impacts birth outcomes, but over the longer term, using this data to develop more predictive algorithms and better risk stratification models to allow doctors to earlier identify potential complications in a more effective way than they are available to do today. From a service standpoint, Bloom Life is providing remote prenatal care screening services. The first service we're focusing on is around remote antepartum fetal monitoring for high-risk pregnancies in the form of what's called a fetal non-stress test. This test today requires patients to come into the hospital or the doctor's office if they're high risk, starting in the third trimester twice a week on average. It's very time consuming, it's inconvenient, and it also takes up a fair amount of clinical time in terms of staff, room, and equipment. And so Bloom Life is developing the ability to move this test to the home, thereby improving convenience and comfort for patients, improving access, freeing up a lot of clinical resources to allow them to more effectively spend time with the patients that are in the patient appointments, and then also saving payers time. I'm going to jump ahead here because, again, this is not exactly the deck that I was going for. We're backed by a lot of mission-aligned clinical partners and funding agencies. And just really quickly to kind of speak about the long-term research, which, again, I'm not really sure if it's in here. Here we go. The idea here is that with Connected Care, we are generating a data collection engine with initial focus on improving access to existing prenatal tests. So, for instance, this fetal non-stress test. Today, we're just developing the ability to move this test from a high-cost inconvenience center, which is the hospital or doctor's office, and move that into the home. We still provide information exactly how doctors would expect it today. But behind the scenes, what's happening is we're actually collecting these very large longitudinal data sets to develop digital biomarkers. Once we have identified these digital biomarkers, we can validate them in prospective studies and look to see how do we develop new clinical decision support tools or predictive digital biomarkers to improve screening and management of the most complicated complications today, such as preterm birth. And so it's kind of, it's one step leads to another. To date, we've collected data from over 12,000 women. Most of them, about 30%, were high risk, and amounts to about 1 million hours of longitudinal physiological data, which is, to our knowledge, the largest physiological data set in the world on maternal and fetal health. With this data, we've been able to effectively run a first round of digital biomarker discovery to essentially identify an algorithm, which essentially is a combination of physiological features that allow us to identify labor onset with the same accuracy as a doctor who's giving a pelvic exam. And what this really opens up the possibility of doing is doing things such as earlier identifying spontaneous preterm labor, reducing unnecessary trips for false labor, and potentially also looking at the ability to reduce unnecessary C-sections. And so this biomarker has now been, we're partnering with a number of investigator-initiated studies looking at application of this into a couple of those clinical use cases today. So I'll stop here and then look forward to the conversation to follow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. Yeah, for increasing, first of all, the access to maternal care, because it's so interesting, but not every woman has access to such facilities and also insurance to cover such facilities. And you are changing this paradigm for every woman on the earth. Thank you so much. Yeah. And I'm so happy that we have time for an interesting discussion. And it's always great to not only present, but also discuss in depth all the details of our research and products. And I would love to start with a question about what sorts of unique insights your products can give us as a biomarkers of women's health. Yeah, so maybe Priyanka, you can start with.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, I think maybe ours is a little obvious, but it's obviously what's going on in the vaginal microbiome, right? So that might mean, you know, today when you think about, is my vagina healthy? First of all, that's only a question you ask when you have symptoms. And in fact, if you don't have symptoms, by clinical definition, you are fine. Even though 80% of women who have a dysbiotic vaginal microbiome don't have any symptoms. Today, if you don't have symptoms, you're fine. And we're trying to give someone access to, as you were saying before, proactive and preventative ability to actually check in with what's going on down there. So something that we really care a lot about measuring is not just, you know, what a PCR test would do, which is say, is this very specific pathogen present, but actually just show us the overall community, right? Like, are there healthy microbes present? How much of them? Who are you competing with? What are the pathogens? Who might they be commensurate with? And so right now, we very much give someone a full breakdown of everything that's present, what we know about those microbes, also what we don't know. We are very transparent about where there isn't enough research yet. And then obviously we help someone understand over time, how's your vaginal microbiome changing, right? So Anna, when you were talking about, you know, if you're sleep deprived or whatever it is, for us, it's a lot of women who are trying new supplements. Unfortunately, the CVS aisle is packed full of things that don't actually work. And for us, you can actually see by testing over time, is your microbiome changing? And that's access to information that women didn't previously have.
And you still can also help physicians to change the treatment options, because so many women have recurrence of vaginal infections.
Totally.
Still, yeah, we only have one antibiotic for that.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that our entire treatment pathway is to throw a bomb at it and then hope a different microbiome grows back is pretty surprising and archaic. But obviously, by providing much more specific information, we hope that doctors can actually make more precise treatment decisions.
That's true, yeah. And I know you covered already organ types, but maybe you can add some more information for our audience.
Definitely. So for us, I think the unique thing that Linus provides is that we're able to provide real world data on arousal and orgasms, which hasn't previously been done. So we call it in the bedroom data, but obviously you can use it anywhere. It doesn't have to be in the bedroom. But basically, in previous work in research, it required the participant to go into a research facility. So it would limit access. It would limit the type of participants who are willing or local to be able to go into these research facilities. And then the other one that is commonly used for sex research is self-reports. So it's just being able to fill out different surveys and all of those things. So we at Linus kind of combine those two things where we're getting that data for biofeedback, but also giving people the chance to put different notes and tags and things like that down so they can self-report things like, oh, I was feeling really sleepy this day, and things like that. Just as a kind of in context, like those are called the FSFI score, is how they kind of measure like sexual pleasure and different indicator scores. They have things like MRI brain scans where they see how the brain scan looks during the orgasm, which is also limiting if you ever Google it. It's really, really cool how it's done, but you can't actually move in the MRI machine or bring vibrators into the space. So you're kind of having to train yourself to be very, very, very still, and then also just figuring out how to have an orgasm, and while they can take scans of the brain. So it's very limiting in terms of, is that how a person actually experiences pleasure? And then there are those vaginal measuring devices where you would have to go into a facility, and then you will have kind of researchers behind a curtain kind of observing those measurements. And so we are able to kind of take in the bedroom and then bring different research around that space. And we're able to do interesting things like even just in the realm of, like, for example, cannabis and CBD, how those different factors can change how the arousal and orgasm looks. And we've had different studies, like marketing studies and research studies, where we partnered with companies like Ease to kind of see how cannabis or CBD can help change how the arousal and orgasms look. And then more interestingly, we've had an interesting one where we have an athlete who's been a long time user, and she was like, something seems wrong with my data. I think my vibrator might be broken. And so we went through the diagnosis process of checking the hardware, and we finally came to this thing of, well, did something happen maybe on the state? Because that's when the orgasms start to look very different or very flatlined. And she was like, oh, she's like, I had a sports injury. She's like, I had a concussion. And it gave us kind of a pause to realize there might be something with traumatic brain injuries or concussions and how that could affect your sexual pleasure, or vice versa, or being able to indicate those kinds of different effects from something that is as interesting as orgasm data. And so that was something we were able to present at a medical conference of, like, oh, maybe a way to look at traumatic brain injuries and sexual function and the correlations between the two. So I think just interesting things that people maybe would not have researched previously, or giving these like small indicators of things that could be continued to be researched because of our real world data.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And women have control of their body finally, and they have recognized these signs, and maybe it will be the first symptom of even women's disease. That's really great. Yeah, Eric, would you like to add some insights from your bed?
Yeah, sure. And I think maybe one thing that I think is important to highlight here is that I think what you might see is that for all the companies here, that the ability to consumerize health, to be able to move things out of a lab and into the home, it really is presenting this incredibly unique opportunity, where before the cost of collecting this data would have been so prohibitive that, given how much funding has gone into women's health research, even though it's increasing, these kind of insights that you're hearing about would have been years and years and years away from now. But as we see the more consumerization of products that are actually putting technologies into consumer-friendly form factors, market them to women and to patients, and to be able to use that channel to actually aggregate these data sets at a speed, cost, and really fidelity that really is unprecedented, I think is an important thing to highlight. And I'll sort of talk about the fidelity side of things from our side, because like the other speakers, there's been a huge lack of research in maternal health. A lot of the most sort of pressing complications of pregnancy are still poorly understood. And part of the challenge is to collect data before requires people to go into the doctor's office or to a lab and get, even for prenatal care checkups, you're going, once a month, maybe once every other week. And so for a lot of the collection of data, you're just getting very sparse data. When you start moving things to the home, though, you could start to open the possibility of getting a data point every day. And that longitudinal nature of things allows you to start seeing physiological changes that you would maybe otherwise you would see, but it would be too sparse to really be able to draw any conclusions from it. And so, the data that we have came from an earlier version of the product we had on the market. Was a consumer version of what we're now submitting to the FDA, but ultimately allowed us to look at physiological changes that occurred in the third trimester with mom, with the specific looking at uterine coordination. So the uterus is a muscle, it's a smooth muscle. And throughout the third trimester, even second trimester, it could have contractions called Braxton-Hicks contractions, which tend to be pretty localized contractions, not really coordinated. And as a mom goes from a non-laboring to a laboring state, we found that the actual coordination of the uterine muscle changes. A pacemaker cell, if you will, emerges in the uterus, and it actually causes the uterus to coordinate to actually push the baby out rather than just having random firings. And so with our device, we were able to measure that shift from a non-coordinated to a coordinated state because we're looking at not just the pressure change on the abdomen, which is how the traditional devices work in the hospital setting, but we're actually looking at the electrical activity of the uterine muscle. And so we were able to measure that combination of changes as well as the activation of the mom's sympathetic nervous system to say, okay, this mom's gone from non-labor to labor. And that is a pretty big scientific breakthrough that no one really knew before. And so we were able to generate this using consumer generated data and validate in a prospective study with an entirely novel data set and benchmark that against standard of care, which is a doctor asking mom come in, giving her a pelvic exam, measuring contraction frequency, and essentially saying, okay, you're in labor, not labor. And so that's a really kind of interesting starting point. In and of itself is kind of interesting scientifically, but I think it has to move forward. And so, as I was mentioning, where we're going from here is to really look to see how do we apply this into clinical needs. And so one of them is earlier identification of spontaneous preterm labor. And if I got to earlier identify a mom who's going to spontaneous preterm labor, I can improve care coordination downstream. I perhaps can improve delivery of known interventions. So that's one thing we're looking at. And then there's another researcher out of OHSU that's looking at application of this into being able to better stage labor progression. Today, misdiagnosis of labor arrest is the number one reason for unnecessary C-sections. And so actually having a more objective means of measuring how a woman's labor's progression could actually either say, we should have an intervention now, such as augmentation or a C-section, or this is actually perfectly normal for her. We just need to give her more time. And so I think we're just at the starting point for where these new data sets and biomarkers, if you will, can actually drive better outcomes.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think we should add some chapter to OBGYN books on biology of contractions and your innovation. Thank you so much. Yeah, and you pointed the lack of research, and it's really unbelievable that only in 1993 women were no longer banned from participating in clinical trials, as Priyanka said in her presentation. And of course, we're still collecting data for our further research and further innovations. And I was interested in how such systemic lack of data collection in women's health has rendered creating your products difficult. And secondly, please point out how did you go about circulating that and sourcing the information you needed in order to create your innovation? So maybe we'll start with Priyanka as well.
Yeah, I mean, I could speak for a whole hour on this. I mean, it is just unbelievable to me how little we know about the female body. And I think in the next keynote talk, we'll hear a lot more about this from an amazing expert as well. But there is just so much that we don't know, right? And I think to this day, as you said at the beginning, Yana, so much of why disease manifests in women, how it manifests in women, what the right biomarkers are to pay attention to, what the right drugs are, if they even exist, is just so unbelievably under-researched. And I'm so glad that there are so many companies that are finally starting to look at this, because not only is it a massive problem, but it's also a massive opportunity, right? The healthcare is the largest contributor to the US GDP. or third largest contributor, and women are 50% of the population. So there's a lot we can do better here that I think is very exciting. Obviously, the lack of investment into understanding the vaginal microbiome is the reason that so many women continue to, in my opinion, unnecessarily suffer today. And it definitely it made it really difficult for us to do every single part of what we do. We always say like everything about building a company is hard, but this just made it so much harder. Everything from, making sure we had the right type of sequencing for the type of sample we were taking. And most of the, validation and thinking about sequencing techniques has been done for the gut microbiome. And as you mentioned earlier, there's huge differences in the gut microbiome and the vaginal microbiome. And actually what you're aiming for is actually usually the opposite. So you want high diversity in the gut, but really low diversity in the vagina. And so a lot of the standards just didn't apply, right? From the sequencing itself to the actual bioinformatics pipelines and the ability to match to the right databases, and then to the actual understanding to the user of like, what is this? It is crazy to me how many very common microbes exist in the vagina that we don't know anything about, or that we only describe at a really high level, even though we see massive genetic variation in the actual results themselves. And I think the way that we dealt with a lot of this ambiguity and uncertainty is what I always say is just transparency. We are just very upfront with what is well-researched and understood and what isn't, right? How can we treat women like they're smart enough to have the best data on their own bodies, and also smart enough to understand when something isn't, a perfect outcome, right? And so what we actually do is we had our medical and science advisory board rate all of the kind of information that we share with women as either established, emerging, or novel. And that way we're able to share insights with women kind of across the spectrum. And we link directly to the research itself, because again, women are capable of reading it and understanding it. So that's kind of definitely played a huge role in our development, the lack of research. And then we've handled it by just being very transparent about where it stands.
Yeah, totally. Anna, would you like to add something from your side?
Yeah, so for us, interestingly, because we came in from more of a like consumer tech hardware product that was very B2C, the interesting tidbit of how we started is that we actually wanted to start with a AI vibrator that was very like in terms of a smart vibrator, that it would move, it would change like how it moves and different positions and the vibration patterns, because it kind of uses AI to learn what you like and you don't like. And as we started that endeavor to want to build that product, we realized we couldn't do it because there wasn't even information or papers or research or anything about sexual function, sexual pleasure, how it works, especially for female bodies. And so we realized just we weren't able to build that product without even just for us to put that information and actually understand that information. So even when it came to developing the product, when we were talking about putting these biofeedback sensors, it was even to the point of having to go to ask many doctors, many pelvic floor therapists of, well, where should the sensor go on the shaft, right? Like being like, should it be positioned weight, like how much further inwards and towards the vaginal canal, like where should it be? And because there's just such little information. And so like, interestingly, like one of the papers that are still most cited, one of the most cited papers to this day is Boland's paper, and that was written in 1982, and it had 11 cis women participants in that research, and that's still very commonly cited research showing how sexual function works for women. And it's just interesting, I think, in the sense of like, if we're looking at papers for male sexual function to female sexual function papers, it's about 5-1. And that's most of the papers that are written for female sexual function is very focused on fertility and not really in the sexual pleasure realm. And we really see that, I think, just very often and historically, scientific research has been has seen the understanding of female sexual response and orgasm as unnecessary or pornographic, or just, and so there, and that it's not specifically related to women's health. And so although there's interestingly so many research papers linking male sexual function to health, like cardiovascular disease, and those are really pushed by pharmaceutical products like Viagra, Cialis, and all of those, but we just don't see that for female sexual function yet. And so I think for us, one of the big things was taking back that, well, AI vibrators could be really cool, but it's not really solving the problem of everything else that is lacking in information. So like the research platform that we've built, we're just here to not be experts in being like, we know everything about exactly how this works, why it works like this for every body. We're just here to try to get that information and actually see what we can do with that information once we gathered it, and actually partner with the experts in these fields to be able to expand the research versus whether it's like post-pregnancy or post-menopausal, or just different effects and how those can have correlations to sexual function.
Yeah, get as much diverse information as you can. Yeah, so the clinicians
Definitely.
would be able to check that with you as well. And Eric, would you mind to add something?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, when we started and still to this day, our focus is from a long-term perspective is addressing preterm birth. Preterm birth is the biggest problem in obstetrics. It affects 26 million babies per year globally. It's the number one killer of children under the age of 5. And it's a complex disease with many etiologies. And as we were looking at the data collection side, where we started was to look at all of the different pregnancy complications that are known that increase risk of preterm birth, look at what is measured and monitored for each one of those specific conditions. Look at the medical literature to see where are sort of the emerging science that is sort of outside of physiological conditions. And I think, Evie mentioned already with the vaginal microbiome being another big area of research, and really starting to focus on what could we start by collecting today that would improve delivery of current standards of care. But as we start to build up the data sets with real world outcomes over time, could really start to build a more complete picture of how are these different risk factors potentially interplaying with each other. How would we partner with companies such as Evie to pull in orthogonal data sets to what we have today, whether or not that's microbiome, blood-based biomarkers, and really develop a much more complete data set to see, okay, now that we have these data, and can we start actually applying machine learning with the outcomes that we're seeing to see, can we start to, again, build better risk stratification models that allow us to tailor interventions, or at the very least improve communication between patient and provider. One of the things that we found in our early days and discussing with a lot of clinicians is that, surprising to us, a lot of doctors wouldn't tell women that were at risk of preterm birth that they were at risk of preterm birth. It was completely baffling to me that they would know this woman has a very high probability of living preterm, but we don't want to tell her because we're afraid she's going to get scared. And it's just completely insane. And I think part of it is that there's this feeling of hopelessness and helplessness, perhaps, that there's nothing they could do and there's nothing the patient could do. But I just don't know if that's true. And I think that if you actually start to equip patients with the right information about what their risk factors are, especially the ones that are modifiable, then it actually helps facilitate a much better conversation with the patient than what you would otherwise have. And so for us, that's kind of how we thought about the data collection, and really a core part of what we try to do is empowering the moms. I feel like they have a right to know that they can handle the information if it's presented in the appropriate way. And if anything, it actually builds a stronger ally with the clinical teams, since no one cares more about how this pregnancy is going to go than the mom. And so really trying to facilitate in that doctor-patient relationship and partnership really is part of what we're aiming to do.
Yeah, thank you so much. We have a lot of questions from the audience. I guess we should start checking them out. And the first one is, do you have plans to work with Medicaid populations to make your products more accessible? And if so, what do you think that would look like? So, Eric, I think you should start.
Yeah, sure. That's obviously an incredibly important question for us, since we're developing prenatal care solutions, and about 45% of births in the US are to women on Medicaid. For us, the starting point is to develop services that are reimbursable using existing CPT codes. So for those who aren't familiar with, healthcare products and services are paid for by insurance companies based upon a coding structure. And if there's a code available and there's coverage by the payer, then typically they could get reimbursed by insurance companies, and therefore, depending upon your insurance, of course, there's no out-of-pocket pay, especially for Medicaid moms. And so that's for us a starting point. And so everything we're doing today is reimbursable by insurance, especially not the consumer version, but the version we're getting through the FDA will be. And then as we think about the more novel things, it's really about then building up enough clinical evidence on how these tools are impacting outcomes such that you could actually apply for, new coding as necessary and coverage with insurance companies. And so it has to be grounded in research and evidence-based research that actually shows improvement in outcomes.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and Priyanka, are you going to work with Medicaid
Exactly
population?
the same. I mean, I
Same
think we have a
here.
very, very similar model, right? Which is deliver better insights and information to patients and doctors today based on what we know, and then use that information to build new understandings of what we don't know. And then, as he said, you need great evidence, as you should, and great research in order to get those types of reimbursements. And that's obviously, accessibility is key. So we're working on it.
That's true. Anna, what about your product?
Yeah, I just have a very small tidbit because obviously vibrators aren't unless they're not very specifically in like the medical world, but there is actually really interestingly in the past week, there are two, Dr. Alexandra Dubinskaya and Dr. Deborah Lynn Hervinick. They're working with the group at Cedar Sinai, mostly urologists, and working with seeing how vibrators or vibratory devices can actually improve sexual function, strengthen pelvic floors, increasing blood flow, and then also helping things like urinary incontinence. So there's going to be a study that they're kind of leading to just see how, if there are any benefits to having vibrators be part of treatment and things like that. So that's kind of a big thing for us to just see movement within the medical space as well, led by currently Cedar Sinai.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, got it. We also have one large question with interesting background. While the market is growing at a very rapid rate with so many exciting solutions being introduced, unfortunately, research also revealed that a lot of FemTech products and services that are currently on the market are not evidence-based and don't truly lead to improved patient outcomes. Would you say the major reason for this issue is this gender data gap, or are you able to also identify different barriers and reasons for this problem? So Priyanka, would you mind to start?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I think, well, one, I think that women's health gets way more criticism and gets this backlash way more than any other industry. I would tell you that probably you would see the same thing for many products that were targeting men as well. I don't think this is a problem that's unique to women's health. But I will say that I strongly believe that companies, especially when you're a startup, you can't operate the same way as, a SaaS productivity tool when you're a health tech company, right? And nor should you. And I think companies that choose to be patient, choose to focus on building up the research, being transparent, like we said, maybe it's not going to improve outcomes overnight. Maybe it's not going to be, a silver bullet solution. But I think over time, we will start to see that the investment in doing things the right way does lead to better outcomes, right? I mean, there's no way that having data like what Eric, Anna, Evie, all of our companies are working on is not going to change the standard of care. I think we're just really far behind. And I think that there are a lot of solutions that probably do take advantage of the gaps. And I think that's why it's so important to work with the experts and do things the hard way, just so that they're done right. But I do think that women and companies that are focused on women do get a little bit more scrutiny than others, in my opinion.
Yeah, I totally agree. But I guess we still need to publish at least part of our data so people can trust us, and as well as clinicians can trust us and include our innovations in their clinical routine, in their pipeline. So yeah, Anna, would you like to add something to this question?
Yeah, I'm with Priyanka. I really don't have anything more to add on top of it. It definitely is. I mean, definitely there is a gap in just the data that is out there. But yeah, absolutely. I think there's just much more scrutiny when it comes to women's health. And for us, especially when we talk about orgasms specifically, there's just such a lack of information, or it's not as black and white, I think, for a lot of times with female sexual function. And so there's just a lot of different things I think that go into what it means to, for example, have an orgasm, sexual pleasure, arousal, and all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And Eric, I know our products are evidence-based, but still, yeah, would you like to say something about challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important just to acknowledge that 5 years ago, there was no such thing as FemTech, right? I mean, literally, we've all been fighting to build this space from the ground up for the past 5 to 7, 8, maybe 10 years. And so the space itself is incredibly new in terms of companies coming out and putting products on the market. So I think that's important to acknowledge, especially in light of the fact that building up evidence takes time. I've never been part of any research that's at all meaningful that takes under a year to actually run a study. Minimum, right? Minimum that it takes to run a year, and usually it takes way longer than a year to actually run a study, to actually get the results of the study, to actually be able to publish those. I mean, you're looking at minimum year to 2 years to actually get any meaningful piece of research out there. So I think it's important just to kind of calibrate a little bit of where the space is in terms of the age of it and what the expectations should be. All that being said, and I agree that there's perhaps more scrutiny here, but you know what? Like, we should all also like set a better standard than maybe the other business that are out there. And so it does take time to build the evidence. I think it also just has, people need to go in and think about building like the layers of evidence on top of each other. You're not going to go in, build a product like, hey, look at, I figured out how to solve preterm birth. No, like, it has to start with like, okay, do I have a product that people can use and will use, that is actually engaging for them, that's actually clinicians can use, it fits in the clinical workflows. I mean, it starts with basic usability for these tools, and then it gets to the next, endpoint you might be looking at is something around, the ability to identify something with equivalent to standard of care, and then you build upon that. So you really have to layer these research in a thoughtful way, and I think that's what that Priyanka was saying is you just have to be thoughtful about your clinical research strategy and just give it time, because if you swing for the fences, chances are you're going to fail.
Yeah, it definitely took so many years. Yeah, it's a challenge for our companies. And unfortunately, our time is up. It was so great meeting you guys here. And thank you so much for joining us and for the productive discussion of many gaps in women's healthcare. And female body should no more be a mystery. And I believe we are a step closer to that. Thank you so much for your innovations and for your speech. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, Ariana is back on our virtual stage. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for joining us. You were all terrific, beyond terrific. Anna, I loved how you talked about how orgasms are a canary in the coal mine, and about how most of the products we have today have been engineered for men. And it was really original the way you guys visualize sexual pleasure with the different names and orgasm patterns: ocean wave, avalanche, and volcano. And Priyanka, I mean, I think it sums it up when you said that as a person with a vagina, you had no access to information about your own health, and how insane that is, and about giving information directly to women and allowing them to make decisions. Yeah, evaluate the decisions based on information. You weigh it, whether it's reliable, whether it's not. And Yana, how you said that maybe we should add some chapters to gynecological textbooks. Yeah, I don't think that only applies to contractions.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, I think we've shown it applies to the whole female body. And also how you talked about publishing part of the data so clinicians can start to include it in their clinical routine. And Eric, I think he left us, but well, yeah, he was also immensely insightful about building up large longitudinal data sets so we can start to identify digital biomarkers, to have predictive biomarkers, to start making progress in women's health. And I think that that's what's so inspiring about all of your companies. You're collecting the data sets so we can actually start to make progress, and we can't